Hey, what's up, guys? Okay, so Eden Zero Chapter 123 is out. The title of the chapter is actually called Light of Justice, although personally I think a better title would be 20 pages of Shiki getting beat down, because pretty much the entire chapter focuses on the fight between Shiki and Justice, picking up where the last one left off with Shiki throwing that punch at Justice and him just easily catching it, and then from that moment on, Shiki, no matter how hard he tries to fight back, just does not hold a candle to how strong Justice is, and that is before he even reveals what his Ether Gear ability is, which we'll get to that in a moment. And I mean, this isn't really anything new. We've seen Shiki get his butt kicked plenty of times throughout the series by other characters, but this felt different because of the fact that Shiki, in those other fights, like with with Draken Joe, with Jin when he learned how to use his overdrive, those fights were different because those characters were people that you knew Shiki would eventually end up defeating because they're opponents for him. But when it came to Justice, because of the fact that Justice doesn't really even care about Shiki, he's only using Shiki as a way to vent his anger towards Elsie. We don't really know if at any point Shiki's ever going to be able to defeat Justice. And I don't mean that as in Shiki's never going to get stronger than Justice. Of course he will by the end of the series because he's the main character. But because of the fact that Justice isn't really after Shiki, he's not really an opponent for Shiki, he's mostly after Elsie. And he's only fighting Shiki right now because of his connection to her. There's nothing to say that these two characters will ever fight again after this. Now, it is worth mentioning that throughout the entire fight, Shiki did not actually activate his overdrive, but even with his overdrive, I don't think that Shiki would have won this fight. I think if he had activated it, he probably would have been on the same level as Justice prior to him activating his Ether Gear ability, but once he did that, I feel like that Shiki would have just ended up losing anyway. Now, once Justice actually activates his Ether Gear ability, he gets a brand new costume which looks very similar to the kind of clothes that Jalal wore in Fairy Tail, which again, when it comes to Jalal, or when it comes to Elsie and Justice, Hero really likes to remind us that these two characters are based off of Jalal and Urza from Fairy Tail. But anyway, once he actually activates his Ether Gear ability, we see his powers are, again, similar to the way Jalal's works in Fairy Tail. In fact, I believe that one of the abilities that he actually uses at the end there has a similar hand motion that Jalal would use when he was actually masquerading as Mr. Gun to use Mr. Gun's ultimate attack during the Grand Magic Games. So again, reminiscing and reminding us of his connection to Jalal. But what we end up finding out from this chapter is that Justice actually has the same Ether Gear ability as Elsie does, which has me really interested in what the connection between these two characters are. I mean, they've always been connected since the beginning of the series, since both of their introductions. But now I'm wondering, what is their backstory? What is their history between these two characters? Because, I mean, we really don't have that many examples of characters having the same Ether Gear ability. I mean, there's Shiki and Ziggy, obviously, because of the fact that the two of them are family. We already know what the connection is there. And we know that Shiki and Ziggy have the same gravity Ether Gear that Shura does. But we don't really know anything about Shura just yet, so we don't know if there's any connection between those characters. Obviously, older Wise and younger Wise have the same Ether Gear ability, but that's because they're the same characters, just from different timelines. So yeah, because of the fact that we don't have that many examples of characters having the same Ether Gear ability, and most of them are characters who are connected to each other, this really leads me to think that there is some kind of connection between Elsie and Justice from their past. And I'm wondering if it's going to be something similar to what Urza and Jalal went through, where how back in their past when they first met, they were both slaves. And I wonder if it's going to end up being something similar to that, because we already know from Elsie's backstory that the reason why she ended up meeting Ziggy was because of the fact that they picked her up when she was actually a refugee from the war. So I'm thinking that their connection actually is that they grew up in the same place, but once the war broke out and they became refugees because their home was destroyed, that they eventually ended up going their separate ways, with Elsie eventually getting picked up by Ziggy's crew for a few weeks. But Justice, on the other hand, was actually picked up by someone from the Interstellar Union Army, and if that's the case, it could actually really explain his black and white views on Justice, because even in this chapter, he pretty much lays out that the only reason why he thinks that Shiki really needs to die, besides his connection to Elsie, is because of the fact that he's connected to Ziggy, and since Ziggy is technically a villain, if Shiki's left unchecked, he could eventually grow into a villain, potentially. Potentially. He has no flat-out real reason to think that Shiki actually will become a villain, become a criminal, but he says because he's connected to Ziggy and Elsie, and he has some unique powers that are tied to them, he could potentially be a threat. So because of that, he's going to kill him here and now. So yeah, like I said in my last chapter review, I really don't think a lot of fans are going to be digging Justice after this arc is over. Because with his black and white views on everything, and the fact that he's trying to kill Shiki for no good reason, I really see a lot of fans just turning against him. In fact, we even see in this chapter, surprisingly, complete opposite from what we ever seen from Urza in Fairy Tail. We even see in this chapter when Elsie shows up, like I called in the last chapter that she would, when she shows up to rescue Shiki after he gets his ass kicked by Justice throughout the entire chapter, she shows up and she is pissed. She looks at him the way that Urza would look at characters who hurt her friends back in Fairy Tail. And you can tell that there is no love lost between these characters. She means business when she shows up to fight justice in order to protect Shiki. And again, it's a real far cry from what Urza would do back in Fairy Tail, because whenever we would see Urza and Jalal together, even back when Jalal was technically possessed by that evil spirit and technically evil, she still never looked at him the way that Elsie is looking at justice in this chapter. So since Elsie is very clearly out for blood by the end of the chapter, it really makes me wonder what's going to end up happening with these two characters later on. Because since the beginning of the series, since their introduction, we've been getting a lot of hints that there's some kind of romantic connection between the two characters, not only from their own crew members, but I believe we also had some flirting from Elsie herself. And I'm wondering if all of that was basically just Hiro making fun of the fact that everyone's already called out that these two characters are pretty much just carbon copies of Urza and Jalal from Fairy Tail, and saying that, oh, because of the fact that they were romantically interested in each other in that series, obviously these two characters have to be romantically interested in each other in this series, basically just making a joke of it, and there's really not going to be any romance between them later on. Or maybe Hiro's planning on doing just kind of a reimagining of the journey that Urza and Jalal went through in Fairy Tail to get to the point where they're at in Fairy Tail Wonder Your Quest, where I don't think they're actually a couple right now, but they have openly admitted their feelings for each other, I believe. So maybe we're going to see something like that happen in this series where, eventually after Justice does a lot of character growth and realizes that the world's not black and white, he can eventually reveal that he actually is romantically interested in Elsie, and then maybe she will as well. And hopefully this actually will end up coming out after we eventually find out what their backstory and connection to each other are. Again, I'm still leaning toward the idea that the two of them grew up in the same place, and then once their home got destroyed by the war, that they end up getting separated and, growing up under different people. Now, during the chapter, we actually do take a quick break on the fight to check in with Herman and Wise, and admittedly, this actually was a pretty interesting moment for the chapter. We actually got to see a little bit more of Dr. Mueller basically torturing Hermit by making her remember all the pain that she went through prior to him being arrested from his experiments. But we don't really see anything done to her in this chapter besides her kind of like remembering that fear. And we do get to see a little bit of, of a conversation between Wise and Dr. Mueller, where Wise basically tells him to get away from Hermit. And then eventually Mueller realizes that Wise is actually the same Wise who he's kind of jealous of right now because of the fact that Wise is such a big genius, but he kind of gave his knowledge and intelligence away freely instead of basically pursuing money for it. And then we see at the end of that whole thing that Dr. Mueller basically just kind of picked Wise up, and he kind of implies he's going to take his brain and experiment on it and try to basically take his intelligence for himself. It was actually a kind of interesting moment from the chapter, but it felt a little bit out of place the way Hiro put it in literally the middle of the chapter. It felt almost like that he was planning on having that moment where Justice uses that final attack on Shiki as basically a way to kind of like end that fight for this chapter and then finish the chapter off by focusing on Dr. Mueller and Hermit and Wise. But after a few pages, he kind of changed his mind and decided to go back to the fight. And again, it felt just a little bit weird. Maybe if we actually had this moment with them basically in the beginning of the chapter or at the very end of the chapter, it would have felt better. But having it literally in the middle of the fight and then going back to the fight right after that, it just felt a little disjointed. Oh wait, before I end the video, I forgot to talk about the fact that Justice actually mentions in the chapter that him and Elsie's Ether Gear ability actually is very similar to the heavenly body magic from the Dark Ages, which obviously is from the time where magic actually existed in this universe. And what's interesting about that is that heavenly body magic is actually the same magic that Jalal uses in Fairy Tail. So again, a connection between those two characters. But anyway, guys, that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what you guys thought about the chapter in the comment section down below. If you liked the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. I would greatly appreciate it. Comment down below your thoughts and theories, like I said, and I will catch you guys next time. Peace.